Okay, now that we've looked at an example of speciation, we need to define what a species is. So a species is a population or group of population whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. So the big thing here is that they are able to reproduce, and those offspring are fertile, meaning their offspring are able to reproduce. So they are reproductively compatible. So an example of two organisms that are in different species are horses and donkeys. So a horse and a donkey, while they can mate, they are considered two different species because their offspring is infertile. So, and this is actually getting at the genetics. The reason why is because horses have 64 chromosomes and donkeys have 62. So when their gametes are produced and combined, the mule offspring has 63 chromosomes, and that is unable to reproduce because 63 is an odd number, so we cannot give half of the genetics on to the next offspring. So they are not reproductively compatible because of that. And this is called an example of reproductive isolation. So it's a barrier that prevents members of the two species from producing viable, fertile offspring. So our idea of speciation comes into play when we have some sort of change that happens between two populations, making it impossible for them to breed and create viable offspring. So we can categorize those barriers that prevent reproduction as either prezygotic or postzygotic barriers. Okay, so prezygotic, these are preventing mating or hindering fertilization. The big thing here is that the barrier is happening before a zygote is produced. And then postzygotic barriers this is a prevention of the hybrid zygote from developing into a fertile adult. So this would be after the zygote is produced. So some examples of prezygotic barriers include habitat isolation. This is when the two species or the two populations of organisms are physically separated from each other, so they are not able to reproduce. And over time, they're going to adapt to their own environment and have changes that are present. Another example of this is temporal isolation. Temporal is dealing with time. So whether they mate at different seasons or they may be awake at different times, like is showing in this picture, but there's something related with time that prevents them from mating. Behavioral isolation, this is usually in the form of some sort of mating ritual where the behavior of the organisms prevents them from mating, even if they're in the same location. And then mechanical isolation, this is basically where organisms are unable to mate because their genetic their parts don't fit. And then we have gametic isolation, where similar to our mechanical isolation, it's just instead it's the gametes are unable to be produced. So in this case, we have the sperm and egg of sea urchins. In different species of sea urchin, the sperm cannot penetrate the egg, so therefore it's going to be separated from that with that prezygotic barrier. Some examples of postzygotic barriers. Again, these are going to happen after the zygote is produced. And these are, an example is reduced hybrid viability. These are all going to use the word hybrid, which is referring to the offspring that is arising from two species that are mating. So an example of reduced hybrid viability is going to be where species may mate, but that zygote is unable to grow into a viable offspring, or in some cases, if it does develop, it's going to be very frail offspring that's produced. We can also have reduced hybrid fertility. That was like our example with the horse and the donkey, where they can make an offspring, but that offspring is infertile. And then we can have something called hybrid breakdown, where the species are able to reproduce and the offspring are able to reproduce, but when they do, that the offspring are frail or feeble or sterile in some cases. So it's breakdown because we're able to go through a couple generations, but over time they are not viable. Okay, so we can also describe two modes of speciation, and that is in allopatric or sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is another word for other or homeland, is what allopatric means. So these are geographically isolated population. They are in different locations. Okay, it's going to cause by geological events or processes. Maybe something happens and there was a lot of water or rain, and so at one time this was one lake, but then as the waters receded, we end up with two different populations, something like that. And then they evolve by natural selection and genetic drift over time. Okay, sympatric speciation. These are sympatric meaning together, homeland. Okay, so these are overlapping populations within the same area or geographic region as shown here. These organisms live in the same area and could potentially mate because they are in the same area, but for whatever reason, they do not. And we can have gene flow, but they're usually blocked by different genetic barriers, or even something called polyploidy, which is the number of chromosomes that it has. They could have habitat differentiation where they live in different habitats or niches in the environment. They could have sexual selection as some examples. Okay, an example of this is allopatric speciation in squirrels on opposite rims of the Grand Canyon. They are physically in different locations and unable to mate because of that. Sympatric speciation by polyploidy, an example of this is in strawberries. So strawberries have interesting genetics and number of chromosomes where they can actually have multiple copies of the chromosomes, which is called polyploidy, and that prevents them from reproducing with some other strawberries. Okay, and now we're going to talk about hybrid zones. So this is where we're having incomplete reproductive barriers, where some organisms or some species of two different populations are able to interbreed some. And we can either have reinforcement, fusion, or stability. So reinforcement, this is when we're going to strengthen those reproductive barriers and they will end up being two different species over time. We can either weaken those reproductive barriers and over time they join and become one species, or we can have stability where we're going to continue to have that hybrid, that offspring that's produced. An example of this is grizzly and polar bears. While we definitely consider them different species because of behavior and all sorts of different characteristics, they are actually able to reproduce and make a viable offspring. So over time, we can have reinforcement or fusion happening, especially when their geographic locations start to overlap. And we can see that that happens because they are very closely related, especially in comparison to all of the other bears and organisms. I have a video for you to watch that talks about this example a little more.